Mrs. Johnson swiftly noticed a peculiar change in her equine companion, Daisy. A certain agitation and unease had come over her, an anomaly from her normally tranquil demeanor. Though Mrs. Johnson had recognized such signs in expectant horses before, it seemed strange given Daisy hadn't shown any pregnancy indicators. As Daisy's discomfort heightened, it became clear her condition was indeed an impending childbirth. The arrival of the little colt left everyone in awe. The cause of the surprise, however, was not what you'd typically expect. After a final heave of effort, the colt's head and front limbs emerged. Shortly after, the full body appeared, and Daisy lovingly cleaned her offspring, appearing content with the recent ordeal, yet around her was pure silence. Everyone looked at the colt in sheer disbelief. This was not the outcome anyone had predicted. The family's trusted vet, Dr. Thompson, wore a stern expression. Strangely, he hadn't communicated anything to the Johnson clan yet. He just methodically gathered his items. "Dr. Thompson," Mrs. Johnson cautiously queried, "do you have a reason for this?" His reply was only a muffled utterance. "What was happening?" began the veterinarian. "I regret to inform you, this is not a colt." Mrs. Johnson was flabbergasted. Not a colt? She wondered. What else could it possibly be? But what was the truth about Daisy's offspring? Why was the vet behaving so peculiarly? And how did Daisy become pregnant in the first place? In a quaint village tucked away in the verdant countryside, there sat a charming farm belonging to the Johnson family. The Johnson lineage had been steering their agricultural endeavor for numerous generations, and their notable affection and commitment towards their menagerie, particularly their cherished mare Daisy, was celebrated throughout their community. Daisy, an attractive black horse possessing a mild demeanor, was loved by all in the village. Daisy had never been paired for breeding, with the Johnsons primarily keeping her as a companion animal. Consequently, it was unexpected, on a sunny spring daybreak, when they detected Daisy behaving peculiarly. She was trotting restlessly within her enclosure, neighing and striking her hooves on the floor, all signs pointing towards distress. Mrs. Johnson, an adept horse owner, had encountered such signs priorly and presumed Daisy could be giving birth, which, considering she had no signs of carrying, was highly unanticipated. The Johnson kin had adopted Daisy few years prior from an associate who ran a farmhouse a couple of villages farther. Daisy's previous custodians couldn't continue owning a horse, but made sure she would be embraced by a nurturing household. The moment the Johnsons laid eyes on Daisy, they instantly knew they had ample space for her at their farm and could provide her with an excellent life. Daisy was different from their other horses. They were aware of her challenging past, having previously worked in a circus and later at a private farm after an injury brought her career to an abrupt halt. Daisy's outgoing behavior made her perfect for performing in front of crowds, but the Johnsons wanted to ensure she would not be returned to such a stressful environment. Unlike the other horses at their farm, Daisy's routine was quite unrestricted. They didn't use her for loading hay or hauling materials like the other horses. Instead, Daisy was permitted to unwind and relish her days, providing her with substantial time off from her years of labor. However, the Johnsons were oblivious to the fact that someone had disrupted Daisy's easygoing future. Shortly after, they got in touch with the local veterinary doctor, Dr. Thompson, who arrived at the farm as soon as possible. He had been the Johnsons' reliable vet for several years and had a good understanding of Daisy's condition. Upon his arrival, an anxious Mr. Johnson greeted him and guided him to Daisy's enclosure. Once Dr. Thompson reached Daisy's stall, he quickly evaluated her situation. He could tell she was experiencing labor, with the birth of the foal drawing near. Mrs. Johnson was utterly puzzled. No male horse had been in the same vicinity as Daisy, so how did she get pregnant? However, she soon realized that the mystery was a lesser concern, since Daisy was nearly ready to give birth and required as much assistance as possible. Fortunately, Dr. Thompson had brought along all the requisite tools and arranged everything in case they were needed. But initially, Daisy had to attempt on her own. According to Dr. Thompson, Daisy was in the early part of her labor. It might take a couple of hours or even a day for full labor to kickstart, so all they could do in the meantime was to wait. But Mrs. Johnson didn't sit idle. She had to discover who the father of Daisy's unborn foal was. Perhaps that would give insights into the foal's characteristics. They had installed cameras around the farm following another incident that occurred many years ago, so Mrs. Johnson decided to check the footage. She quickly went through the recordings, right about the time when Daisy was suspected of getting pregnant. It wasn't long before Mrs. Johnson noticed something peculiar. As she continued with the review, Mrs. Johnson's eyes broadened with surprise. She was astounded by what was unfolding before her eyes. The evening Daisy was believed to have conceived, she had been by herself in her pen. Astonishingly, on the footage, she saw an unexpected presence. The gate was unlatched, and a male horse sauntered in. Immediately, Mrs. Johnson realized that this event had been purposefully coordinated, but who had carried out this act, and for what reason? What did they stand to gain from this? She notified her spouse and Dr. Thompson, and they congregated around the computer monitor to view the puzzling recording together. Suddenly, she identified the male horse. It was Rocky, a horse belonging to their neighbors. Mrs. Johnson had observed some odd behavior from Rocky weeks prior, but it had never crossed her mind that he could be behind Daisy's unexpected condition. When she inspected further, she realized a lady had unlatched the gate and allowed Rocky access to Daisy's pen. A surprise, as Rocky's guardian was a single gentleman. As Mrs. Johnson scrutinized the video, captured by their surveillance cameras, she snapped a series of stills where the woman's face could be clearly discerned. She was unable to recognize the woman from the images and couldn't comprehend how the woman had gotten onto their property, but she was resolved to uncover the truth behind this mystery. This perplexing situation provoked a multitude of questions, but Mrs. Johnson had little time to ponder as she received an urgent call from Dr. Thompson. Daisy had commenced active labor. Mrs. Johnson rushed back to Daisy's pen and found her distressed and lying on the ground. Not much longer now, Dr. Thompson stated, happiness evident in his expression. Spotting Daisy's abdominal muscles frequently contracting and relaxing, he determined she was going through robust rhythmic contractions. However, Daisy didn't remain on the floor. She was rolling about, getting up, pacing around her pen, and lying down again, clearly agitated. Yet this was expected to end soon, or so the hope was. Daisy was breathing laboriously, and Mrs. Johnson felt concern for her treasured animal. At the same time, Dr. Thompson reassured her that everything was on track. While Mrs. Johnson understood that she should have faith in her veterinarian, she couldn't overlook Daisy's unusual behavior. Sweat was streaming down the horse's face, and her eyes wide with apprehension. Despite Dr. Thompson being the professional, Mrs. Johnson had been with her horse through all demographics. Hence, she could not ignore her instinct when she felt something wasn't right. She voiced her concern to Dr. Thompson once more. Still, his feedback remained the same. Here, Mrs. Johnson realized she needed to intervene. She glanced at her husband, who couldn't avoid feeling worried seeing the fear in his wife's eyes. However, they were left clueless as to what they could do next. Dr. Thompson had been constantly alongside Daisy. Then an idea sprang to Mr. Johnson's mind. He took several steps back, even though he was aware that an object was behind him, and deliberately stumbled. Mrs. Johnson and Dr. Thompson let out a gasp when they heard Mr. Johnson stumble. Despite screaming in pain, it did not hurt that much. He dramatized the incident to divert Dr. Thompson's focus, and it succeeded. Dr. Thompson promptly hurried over to Mr. Johnson and assisted him in getting up, without wasting any time. However, this did not provide sufficient distraction for his wife to examine her equine friend. Mr. Johnson clutched his head, groaning. "I need to lie down. My head is throbbing," he feigned distress. "Dr. Thompson, can you help me back to the house?" Dr. Thompson, standing by his side, supporting his arm, was unable to refuse. He tried to signal Mrs. Johnson to take over, but her silence met his glance. "I'll return shortly. Watch Daisy and stay clear," Dr. Thompson directed as he and Mr. Johnson hobbled away. However, Mrs. Johnson was not going to follow the directions. She believed her horse needed tender companionship. Thus, she slowly entered Daisy's stable. Mrs. Johnson moved with deliberate slowness to prevent any startles while Daisy was anxious. However, she was also on the lookout for any information that could reveal the uninvited individual who had invaded their property. Speed was essential. She had to find any evidence before Dr. Thompson returned. Mrs. Johnson initiated her search, sifting through hay barrels and scanning the floor for things the trespasser may have left behind. However, her search yielded nothing. She resolved to keep searching, but then realized something more critical required her attention. As soon as Mrs. Johnson placed her hand gently over Daisy's back, the horse's breathing began to stabilize. She fondly assured Daisy, rubbing her back in a comforting motion. Next, Mrs. Johnson inspected beneath Daisy's tail and noted that her foal was nearly ready to arrive. But something was not right. Daisy had been in labor for an extended period, and yet the foal was nowhere to be seen. Observing Daisy's strain to give birth, Mrs. Johnson understood the real problem. The foal was in the wrong position. This complication was severe, and it wouldn't resolve on its own. They had to assist Daisy, or the consequences could be life-threatening for both mother and foal. When Dr. Thompson came back, Mrs. Johnson quickly briefed him on her findings. The animal doctor acknowledged the gravity of matters and finally relented. He concurred with Mrs. Johnson that it was crucial to aid the newborn horse in securing a more favorable position, with due haste. Every second was priceless. Dr. Thompson promptly beckoned for supplemental veterinary aid, given the urgent nature of the circumstances. Subsequently, an assembly of vets arrived at the ranch to lend their support in the complex childbirth. Dr. Thompson and his cohort of experts in animal health care worked unflaggingly, applying their vast knowledge and tools to facilitate Daisy in her birthing process. They thoroughly evaluated the young horse's position and agreed that it was displayed in a breech position, meaning it was poised to emerge hindquarters first instead of head first. This posed a complex situation that demanded immediate intervention, as it could lead to complications, jeopardizing the well-being of both Daisy and the newborn. With focused exactitude, Dr. Thompson and his team adroitly navigated the breech foal into the proper position for birthing. They employed gentle yet assertive movements, making certain that the youngster's legs were aptly placed to limit the potential harm to Daisy or the foal. It was a gentle and demanding procedure that called for quick decision-making and adept hands. As this was happening, Mrs. Johnson observed a sense of helplessness from the margins. Heartbroken, she watched her cherished horse endure such agony. Granted, she was aware of the perils associated with pregnancy and birthing, but this was unlike any other labor process she had ever seen. She harbored negative feelings for the individual responsible for Daisy's plight. Having concluded that there wasn't much she could do to assist with the birthing, she decided to confront her neighbor with the video evidence of Daisy's suffering. Filled with rage, she knocked persistently on his door, and he swiftly responded. "Mrs. Johnson, why the urgency?" "I was merely having my supper," he said. "Your meal can hold for a moment. What have you done to Daisy?" The neighbor, Philip, looked at Mrs. Johnson with a puzzled look. "I'm entirely clueless about what you're implying," he said, visibly perplexed by her belligerence. "Well, I'll elucidate," Mrs. Johnson declared determinedly. She strode through the door and placed her laptop on the table. "Do me a favor. Elucidate this," she remarked, hitting play on a video clip. Philip was taken aback. His stallion was featured in the footage, but he had no involvement in Daisy's plight. He attempted to convince Mrs. Johnson of this, but she'd turned a deaf ear. She was livid. Philip, however, reassessed the clip, and this time, he noticed a detail. "Hold on," he blurted out abruptly. "I can identify that hand." But instead of answering her, he decided to stay silent. "Well," Mrs. Johnson questioned, "whose hand exactly is it?" The identity of the woman was a question that hung in the air. Philip seemed bereaved, as if delivering the truth was a task too great to bear. "It's my little girl," he murmured. For some inexplicable reason, she had thrust Rocky and Daisy into this pen. Mrs. Johnson burned with the wish to probe further, but an abrupt call stole her attention. Dr. Thompson was on the other end. The foal's arrival was imminent. Without delay, she hastened back to the ranch, Philip treading behind. Arriving at the scene, Dr. Thompson began. "What delayed you? Daisy's losing copious amounts of blood. The foal needs to come forth this instant." Little limbs of the foal were already manifesting, yet Daisy was drained from the prolonged labor. She lacked the vital energy to press on autonomously. Thus, Dr. Thompson secured a unique chain around the newborn's limbs, intending to aid Daisy. Cautiously, he observed her abdomen. With each inward heave, he tugged gently, making the situation quite nerve-wracking. Perspiration trickled down Dr. Thompson's forehead as he again delicately tugged with the next heave. Finally, it seemed like they were making headway. Gradually, the foal started to emerge. Despite the conditions, Daisy appeared to be holding up well. "Give it all you've got, Daisy. One final push," Dr. Thompson coaxed. Preparing for the ultimate tug, he gave everything he had. Subsequently, the foal fell to the ground. A collective sigh of relief swept across everyone present. However, the initial relief quickly turned into worry when the foal lay motionless. Mrs. Johnson's throat tightened, seeing Daisy attempt to nudge the foal into movement. Countless moments felt like infinity. No one could divert their gaze from the immobile foal. As Mrs. Johnson prepared to distance herself from the heartbreaking scene, she noticed a slight movement. Gradually, the movements expanded, and before they knew it, the foal was shakily trying to stand. Elated, Mrs. Johnson embraced Dr. Thompson, yet he didn't reciprocate the joy. He looked unusually ashen, causing her concern. "What seems to be worrying you, Doctor?" Mrs. Johnson probed. "This foal isn't typical," he responded carefully. Mrs. Johnson's brows furrowed. Upon closer inspection, she had to admit the foal didn't resemble its parents. "What could potentially be wrong with it?" she asked the veterinarian. However, her inquiry was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling up her driveway. Wondering who this could be, she saw Philip heading towards the front. That's when it clicked. His daughter was here. Mrs. Johnson was prepared to finally encounter Philip's daughter. She had harbored anger all day about the predicament, especially after Daisy's arduous labor. She felt ready to vent her wrath on anyone who dared cross her path. The words that would come from Tilly, Philip's child, were sure to stagger Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson began to vocally reproach the woman as she approached the stall area. "This harm you've done to my Daisy," she accused with utter disbelief. Dr. Thompson sought to mitigate the escalating circumstances, calmly suggesting, "Let's all remain composed here." "And just who do you happen to be?" Mrs. Johnson demanded. "I'm Philip's child. My name is Tilly," the woman responded. Mrs. Johnson had a vocal outburst once again. "Tilly, here is the one who matched Daisy with Rocky." Tilly let out a resigned sigh. "Indeed I did, and I regret it deeply. In my financial desperation, understanding the wealthy background of Rocky's biological parents, I thought I could turn this into a quick profit somehow." Mrs. Johnson was befuddled by the audacity she was hearing. "How could you possibly profit from this understanding that Daisy is under my ownership?" she queried. Tilly's gaze dropped to the floor as she anxiously twirled her fingers. "My father isn't informed that I conducted a DNA test on Rocky. We had adopted him years prior with no knowledge of his breed, and my curiosity got the best of me." On receiving the results, Tilly was utterly taken aback. Mrs. Johnson, being a horse expert, was equally stunned by Tilly's motives. Mrs. Johnson was aware of the hefty price a rare colt could fetch. However, since it was her mare that had given birth, she had rightful ownership of the foal. Tilly must not have thought this through entirely. Rocky wasn't just an average equine. He was a nick-nab-strupper, an extremely uncommon and expensive breed. Understanding this, alongside my own financial struggles, I harbored hopes of profiting substantially. Yet, I treasured Rocky too dearly. It was inconceivable to let him go. Hence, I had him mate with Daisy. This plan was reckless in hindsight, and that realization dawned upon me when it was too late to act on it. Envisioning purloining the newborn foal wasn't feasible. I deeply regret my actions. I found myself constantly supervising Daisy due to my overwhelming guilt. Upon hearing Tilly talk about her thought process, Mrs. Johnson felt her harsh stance thaw slightly. Despite being irked with Tilly's impulsive actions, she seemed genuinely contrite. Recognizing the economic challenges of farm life, Mrs. Johnson decided against punishing Tilly, given she understood her mistake. "I won't be escalating this to law enforcement, Tilly," she avowed, inducing surprise among the crowd, as her anger had subsided remarkably in mere moments. "Today has been a roller coaster of complex emotions for us all. We could have concluded on a much sour note, but we didn't, thankfully. In the course of a heartbeat, Mrs. Johnson pondered her alternatives and concluded that she indeed had something she craved from Tilly to end this terrible ordeal. Her primary concerns were the well-being of her horse and the newborn foal, and so she made a sole request to the caller. "I need you to vacate my premises and promise not to return," she declared confidently. Accepting the demand, Tilly gave her a nod. She comprehended Mrs. Johnson's reasoning, having broken their trust for her gain. So without any contention, Tilly spun on her heels and exited the property. With Tilly permanently off the ranch and the likelihood of a recurrence greatly reduced due to an upgrade in the security apparatus, Mrs. Johnson shifted her attention to caring for the new addition in her barn. There was no disputing the ownership, since the foal was a product of her steed. But what was she to do with a horse of such potential value? From her knowledge, Mrs. Johnson was aware that the horse's breed could rake in a fortune, but monetary gains were far from her interest. Following the distressing events, her thoughts were solely consumed by the well-being and security of the creatures on her farm, without any added pressures to their existence. Daisy and her newborn offspring recovered fully. The youngling was christened Dorothy by Mrs. Johnson, a name of Greek origin meaning gift of the divine. Rocky, too, was occasionally allowed to forage in the field alongside them. Daisy and Dorothy were never put up for sale by Mrs. Johnson, though she did have certain future aspirations for Daisy. As the years passed, Mrs. Johnson noted that Daisy craved more company. Having performed in shows for years, she could tell that Daisy missed human interaction. To cater to this need, Mrs. Johnson orchestrated a petting zoo to be instituted on her land. People traveled from far and wide to interact with her horses and poultry. Daisy, overjoyed with the attention, got to live out the rest of her years being admired by an endless stream of people daily.